Humans have fundamentally transformed our planet to the extent that you can see our lit up houses and streets from space. But human influence doesn't stop just there, and in fact, in many of the darker areas you see here, the imprint of humans is still there. I'm Gergana Daskalova, and I'm looking forward to sharing more about land abandonment and how it's reshaping ecosystems across Europe. In the last 50 years, human society has seen a mass migration like none before, and perhaps many of us are part of it. I left my small village in Bulgaria to go to university in the UK, and in doing so, I joined millions and millions of people living in cities. And in our research, we often focus on human impacts and how they're intensifying, but human impacts are not just about more and more urbanization. They're also about the flip side, and that's land abandonment. Abandoned land is projected to become increasingly common. So it might have conservation potential, it might be an opportunity for rewilding, or it might be that on abandoned land you actually get very, very few species, and it takes ecosystems decades or centuries to recover. Right now, we simply don't know. So with that in mind, we set out to ask, first, how much land abandonment is occurring in Europe and where are its hotspots. Then we wanted to see what happens to abandoned land over time and what are the changes in land cover. And finally, we wanted to see what species thrive and what species decline in places where abandonment has occurred. When it comes to studying land abandonment, the first catch is that actually because people have left, there are actually very few first-hand observations. And of course, these days, even if humans haven't stepped and seen something with their own eyes, well, satellites have probably recorded imagery of that space. When it comes to remote sensing data, one issue is that it's very hard to disentangle the land cover from the land use. And so field data become particularly valuable. And we use the Lucas dataset, which has thousands and thousands of field observations across the EU. And volunteers and recruited observers set out to record the land cover, but also the land use of all these locations across EU countries. The surveys happen every 3 years, and they have been modified slightly over time, and the survey effort has increased, but there is a recent harmonized dataset that's publicly available that makes it possible to capture the magnitude of land abandonment and track how it's progressing across Europe. To standardize the Lucas field observations, we split the EU countries into equal cells of around 800 square kilometers each, and then we counted how many abandonment observations there were in each cell in each survey year. And what we found was that abandonment has indeed occurred all over Europe, and it is also happening at an increasingly high pace. So here you can see the map of abandonment in 2009, and if we fast forward only 6 years later, in 2015, we can see that abandonment has increased in many areas. Particularly, we found that there are hotspots of abandonment towards the southern latitudes and also in mountain ranges. We found that between 2006 and 2015, the proportion of field observations that found abandonment had nearly doubled. So now we know that indeed there's a lot of abandoned land across Europe. So next we wanted to find out how is the land cover changing in these places. To do this, we looked at the land cover in 2009 and then we compared that to the land cover 6 years later in 2015. we found that there isn't really one single trajectory for abandoned land. For example, sometimes grasslands which were previously used by humans for grazing transitioned into shrublands as well as woodlands, but that wasn't always the case. In many places, grasslands just remained grasslands. There were also areas which returned into agricultural production, but they were very much the minority. When looking at where the different land cover transitions are happening, we found that grasslands were particularly concentrated in the mid-latitudes of Europe, whereas woodlands could occur pretty much anywhere across the continent. This diversity of land cover trajectories following abandonment could perhaps be explained by fire, natural grazing, soil properties, as well as climate variables like temperature and precipitation. When looking at how temperature and precipitation influence the different land cover trajectories, we found that broadly you can have grasslands or shrublands or woodlands occur regardless of the mean annual temperatures. But we did find that shrublands were more likely to occur in places that receive more precipitation. And in the future, we'd like to look at these climate effects in greater detail and see if there is any regional variation, as perhaps it could be that warmer areas lead to woodlands in one place but not in another. Broadly, we did find that in abandoned areas over time, the canopy height is increasing and there is a shift towards denser vegetation. In our final question, we wanted to see how the shifts in abandonment and ecosystem structure relate to changes in species abundance. To do this, we extracted the population time series from the Living Planet database in Europe, and we also looked at other databases, but we found that there are actually very few long-term records from areas with abandonment, and this was the only database that captured species both from abandoned areas and non-abandoned areas. But if you do know of other data that perhaps we could use for this endeavor, do get in touch and let us know. We focused our analysis on birds and mammals because, as often happens in ecology, those were the taxa for which we had population records over time. We found that on average, bird and mammal abundance is higher in areas with abandonment occurring nearby. Particularly, species like the griffon vulture were abundant in places that have experienced abandonment. Looking into further detail, we wanted to explore if species diet is related to whether species thrive or decline when abandonment occurs. We found that carnivorous birds and herbivorous mammals were the two taxonomic groups which increased the most on average, with higher abandonment. From our study, we have seen that abandonment is indeed happening. It's changing ecosystems, but not in the same way everywhere. And I've seen that firsthand here in my home village. So, for example, in the field around me, you can see that there are many saplings of this invasive tree species. And so some places are becoming denser and denser. But there are also areas that seem to just stay a constant grassland, and no tree is putting roots there. So, for example, I took this photo in 2009, and you can see that there's a crumbling wall of where a house used to be, and today that wall is pretty much gone. The stones have fallen, time has passed, but no trees have grown. And that's one of the things that I find particularly fascinating about land abandonment, because it's so complex, and the past land use history, the contemporary climate conditions, all of those factors are interacting to produce perhaps even novel ecosystems. So in a time when we are increasingly talking about slowing down and pausing, rethinking our ways, I'd like to encourage you to also remember the places that have slowed down long ago, the places where there are very, very few people left. And even though all the houses might be empty and no tractors have plowed the land in decades, you can still feel the human influence, and people are transforming our planet not just by cutting down forests or by building bigger and bigger cities. We're changing our planet by abandoning traditional farming practices. We're changing our planet by moving to cities and abandoning fields, gardens, and all of these actions together will reshape how ecosystems look and the biodiversity that they support. I've experienced land abandonment both as a person and as a researcher, and I've seen firsthand how complex the impacts of land abandonment can be. It's definitely a very understudied field, and in the future I would love to design a field monitoring program that looks at how abandonment is influencing biodiversity and ecosystems, and I'm also at the end of my PhD. So if any of you are interested in this topic, definitely feel free to get in touch. Thank you very much.